Let's begin with an overview of who you are and what your affiliation with Sigma Photo is.
My name is Laurence Matson. I'm the person who, among others, started what's called the Sigma Users Group. I don't really work for Sigma. I work for myself. But we have a Sigma Users Group, and that's an interest group loosely affiliated, a bunch of people around the world who are very interested in helping to support Sigma and Foveon in its efforts to further this technology, the Foveon technology. And it started back in 2003 when we set up a website on pbase.com where people were urged to post their best images. And now that has grown this group of people that help them put up images for their shows and things like that. But it's basically an interest group, if you will, and not much more than that.
What about the history of Sigma as well as the relationship between Sigma and Foveon?
The best place to go for that kind of thing is to the web. Go to the Japanese site, and they've got a lot of stuff about the history of the company there. What I can tell more about is what I know more about is the affiliation or the bond between Sigma and Foveon. And that started, there was a time when Foveon was ramping up this so-called X3 technology. And they were talking to a lot of camera companies around the world to see if they're interested in putting something like this in their cameras. And Sigma approached Foveon. So they walked into the booth, I believe, of PMA in 2000, and said they want to use the Foveon technology in one of their cameras. And Sigma at the time was a very modest manufacturer of SLR cameras, film cameras, analog cameras. But that's basically the way it started. It was an initiative made by Michihiro Yamaki, the founder of the company, and he set out to just do that. And he has stated publicly that he just wants to make the best digital camera ever made. And I've heard him say that at dinners and things like that. So it's something he really wants to do, and he felt that this is the technology going forward that would be the one that would have his camera stand out and apart from anyone else's. And it's true.
In 2009, Sigma released a widely anticipated digital camera, the DP2.
Well, the DP2, obviously from the number, is the second in the series of what are called the DP cameras. These are small, pocketable, although that's a term that people argue about, but it will fit inside of a pocket. Cameras with a large capturing device, large sensor, typically about an APS size sensor, and it was meant to have the image quality of a much larger DSLR, but in a pocketable format. The DP1, which came out first, had a relatively wide-angle lens, equivalent to a 28mm lens, and the DP2 had a narrower lens, 42mm equivalent. But at the same time, they also did quite a bit of work on the issues that people felt needed to be addressed in the DP1. They changed the image processing engine, the so-called True 2 image processing engine was put in there. And they did some work on autofocus and overall speed, especially processing speed inside the camera. And so it's not an end of the series by any means. There will be probably other ones that come after it, but it was a change from the DP1 in terms of the lens and an improvement over the DP1 in terms of the processing power and things like that.
Sigma is really the only major player embracing the Foveon chip. Would you elaborate more on this?
Well, they used it in the DP series and the SD series, the full-sized DSLR series. The Foveon imager, which is the proper name for this kind of a thing, is based on a very different technology than standard technology, which is called the Bayer or the color filter array technology. Color filter array generally has a two-dimensional matrix of pixels spread out, each of which has a little colored lens above it, and the image is assembled from that information. It's a complex process, it's a brilliant process, it's capable of producing amazing images, and it has its problems. The Foveon imager is based on stacking these pixels that capture the color information on top of each other inside of silicon. So it's actually an analog imager based on some research done by a man named Carver Mead. And the process then will capture all of the color at each spatial location, at each place on the imager. The result of this is that some of the problems that the CFA, color filter array images, have are eliminated, but there are other ones that come up, and of course it's a very young product, and so these are being developed going forward. There's another company, I can't remember the name, I believe it's Toshiba. They make surveillance cameras, and they've done very well with it. The imager has exceptional qualities for getting a lot more information than it's actually visible to the eye, especially for infrared and ultraviolet in that range. I know that these companies have used the chip in a different way than Sigma has for standard photography. They think it produces the best image, in simple terms. This Foveon imager has what's called single pixel resolution. In other words, from pixel to pixel you can get a different result, and there's nothing fudged in between them, which is not possible with a CFA imager, no matter how many pixels they throw at the problem. And that leads to a very special quality about the image, at least in some eyes. Other people don't see it; they think it's not there. But a lot of people talk about these very rich images with almost a three-dimensional quality, and that's something that comes up time and again. And people who have looked at the early images from these cameras were convinced that this is the way to go in the future, and I don't think that Sigma's going to drop that, especially now that they own the company.
Now, you've talked about some of the differences between the DP1 and the DP2. Do you see a difference in the audience that uses each of these cameras?
There's difference. I mean, the DP1 was a new product. At the time, it was the only camera of its kind in the world. It was a makeshift one camera. And so some of the people that adopted it were the typical early adopter types. I'm going to try something new. And those people generally are willing to really try and work through any issues that come up, and they'll make the camera work for them, or they'll get rid of it real quick. The DP2, with its narrower lens, has appealed more to people who are looking for the modest improvements on the one hand, and they're looking for a different type of lens on the other. The DP1, with its wider lens, lends itself better to landscape photography. The DP2, with its narrower lens, lends itself a little bit more to, strange to the concept may seem, studio work, portraits, and street work. So there's some modest differences there, but the essential difference, I think, was early adopters and the second steppers, so to speak.
As far as the designs go, did a team handle these in Japan?
Well, obviously there's some work cooperative work that goes out with Foveon, which is in California, but essentially it's designed in Japan.
Do you have any interesting stories about people using the DP cameras in unique ways that wouldn't be considered quite so common?
Well, one of the most interesting projects I've come across is a lot of people are using it for aerial photography, and not really for stuff taken from helicopters or planes, but from so-called micro-helicopters or microcopters, or there's a guy in Germany who built a small Zeppelin to carry it around. Other people put them on top of 8-meter poles and take pictures from up there because it's light and produces amazing quality. And so these microcopters, for instance, that's the most interesting thing I've seen probably recently. These are small, remote-controlled, multi-prop helicopters made the idea came from Germany. And they can't take a big payload, so they can't take like a DSLR and get it up there. They need a small camera. And when you get when you spend up to 60,000 euros or $90,000 in one of these things, as some people have, then you want to have also good image quality up there. That's what they were looking for, and that's what they've gotten. I know of a company in Switzerland that's doing this, another one in Vienna that's doing this, and they are over the moon with the results. They just can't believe what they're getting. I know that there are others in Germany that are starting to do this now, and it really is a fantastic thing. And it lends itself to niches, again, in the market. For instance, if you're selling a large and very expensive house, for a long time, what people would like to have is an aerial shot of the property. By the time you hire a real estate agent, hires a helicopter or a small plane, goes up there, flies around, gets the pictures, invested a huge amount of money. These microcopters can go up and do it the same job better, and from a better perspective at about 120 to 150 feet off the ground for a lot less money. And this is a market that's come up, and people are using that. There's also a lot of people that are discovering what great street cameras become. And this is one of the holy grails of the photography business is who's going to come up with the next so-called Leica M that set people off in the 1930s, 1940s on a long and very rich photographic journey with a device that was quick, easy to use, and discreet. And DP1 started in this direction, but the DP2 is really much better at it, and I think that that's an area that people are really starting to find works for them. Some reviewers who do a lot of this have written about that, like Sean Reed in Vermont here. It's fantastic for that. And finally, the third thing that it does very well, and a lot of people are discovering, is that it's the best black and white camera on the market. There's just nothing that touches it in terms of black and white for this size. Very rich blacks, very, very good work is possible with that. The story that's waiting to happen beyond the aerial photography that I just mentioned before, the story that's waiting to happen, though, that in the DP2 is the so-called interval feature that the camera has. In other words, you can take a picture with this camera as long as you want, as long as your card will hold it for every 30 seconds. And that means if you're making Wallace and Gromit films, you can now buy a small camera that you can use to film your entire thing and move your little clay figures around. And this is taken in quality like the movie industry has not seen yet for the big screen. You don't have to worry about resetting the camera or anything like that. You can just set it up wherever you want and then work with your little studio figures, or you can also just throw one drawing after the other if you're drawing cartoons. But this is an amazing feature, and it can also, of course, be used for landscape photography or outside photography or construction photography. If you're building a new stadium and you want to record the whole thing, set it up in a building, plug in the AC adapter, put in a big card, and every 30 seconds just take a picture of your building site. And at the end of it, you've got this amazing movie and amazing quality of what went on there. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the interesting story that's waiting to happen. Somebody will discover this, and suddenly very, very expensive cameras, for instance, like Red makes out there in California, I think it is, will start to look a little bit strange, because this is a camera for $600 or $700 that's doing something that a $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 camera will do, and with better quality as far as I'm concerned.
The reviews appear to be highly reflective of the individual reviewer's taste. Is there anything you'd like to address regarding what you were seeing in print?
Yeah, well, reviewers generally fall into two categories. They have full crew and half empty crew. And within that full range of reviewers, there are people who believe that a camera should do what they want it to do, and there are people who believe that they should try to do what the camera is telling you that it will do. And by the way, this is something that's common to every technological device that I've ever had to deal with, from cars to hockey sticks. So, generally speaking, the reviewers who are most negative are the ones who are saying, well, it's not fast enough for me, or it doesn't do this well enough for me, or that well enough for me. And most people who write more positive reviews say, oh, well, this is a good device for this or that, because that's what the camera will do well. And as an example, because of this outstanding resolution, and the DP2, by the way, has the sharpest lens, at least in my experience, I've ever used in my life. It's just an amazingly sharp lens. In fact, it's too sharp in some instances. If you have that much sharpness and you don't appreciate the value of a tripod, then you'll get blurry images. And you'll say, well, what happened to this single pixel resolution or whatever. But if you put it on a tripod, it's just an amazingly sharp lens. And if you throw some macro filters in front of it, it becomes an exceptionally good macro photography lens, camera. But again, one has to try and do these things and say, well, this is what it's going to do. But people that aren't willing to do that generally will start complaining, and they won't also look for solutions within the camera. They complain about, for instance, slow autofocus, not realizing that there are two autofocus modes, one which is much faster than the other one. What can one do? You can't yell at all this. They see huge communities start reading the manual or something like that. That's just the way things turn out. Because of the fact that Sigma is a relatively small player in this market, there always has seemed to be some problems there or whatever, that people don't take it quite as seriously as they do some of the bigger players, who also sometimes come out with products that require the same approach to really show how they shine. Leica is a good example of that. The Leica M8 doesn't have autofocus, so nobody's complaining about it. They realized from the beginning this is a manual focus camera, and that's just the way it's going to be. You have to cock the lens, they cock the shutter after each shot manually, and so yeah, it becomes a very cumbersome device if everybody takes it with that approach. I'm going to be dealing with a cumbersome device, and let's see what it'll do. It does beautiful work. And the DP's cameras and every other one that I know from any other manufacturer is the same way. They approach it from the camera from what it will do, and not try and impose your will upon the device. The way I look at it.
There have been other issues that some have brought up that maybe you can address. These include the black on black buttons and occasional green hue that washes from edge to edge on some of the images.
I don't know why the black on black, to be very honest. I'd rather have it a little bit better, but I know that founder of the company, Michihiro Yamaki, is a minimalist, and he just believes in understatement, sometimes to the extreme, and I believe that would be part of that would come under that chapter there. But I really can't address that further than that. I have a feeling that has to do with it. When the device, once you get used to it, you don't start looking for what it's going to do, and you don't have to find it. If it's conveniently located and it works well enough, then it shouldn't be a problem. But obviously, for some people who are just starting with the camera, especially a reviewer who only has it for sometimes for a few days, they don't have the time to work with the camera and take hundreds of images and then say all of a sudden, okay, well my fingers sort of work automatically in the back, and I know where everything is, as an experienced user would. The green hue issue that's something that's being worked on through firmware upgrades. Firmware upgrade 102, I think, address that better, but there are technical reasons why that occurs sometimes, and they're certainly being addressed. The camera was designed, going back to the first point about minimalism, the camera was designed with minimalistic and understatement as a overriding part of the concept. A lot of people said, why isn't it more, whatever, curvy or smoother or this or that? And again, the approach of Sigma is basically to understate, keep it simple, the KISS rule. It isn't always that way, but that's what they're trying to do.
Some people have found that the autofocus is a bit slow and not always accurate.
Well, it certainly isn't always accurate, but it's a contrast. It's looking for contrast, and if it doesn't find it, it's going to have trouble focusing. That's just the way it is, and there's no assist light. If it can't find an edge, if it can't contrast, it's going to have trouble. Whether it's a little slow or not, I would argue that it's not as slow as people think it is, because there are, as I said, two autofocus modes, one with an icon and one without an icon, if we put it in simple terms. And if you use it with the icon, then it tries to focus within a narrower range, and it's pretty quick. In fact, I've never found it lacking, to be honest, in that respect. This is not something novel in the technology. Anybody who has ever used a macro lens will notice that there's a full range of focus, and there's a limited range of focus. And on a macro lens, you can limit it to the close-up range, or the far-away range, or the entire range. And if you have to do the entire range, then the camera will go through and look for the whole range and say, okay, we looked at everything, and this is where it's in focus. And if you limit it to one range or the other, it just goes through that narrow range, and it has to go. It takes much less time to go whoop, whoop, and then it says, oh, we found the focus now. So this is nothing novel or ridiculous solution on the part of Sigma. That's just the way things can be done. But the autofocus could generally be faster. Perhaps that would, that can come over time. But at the moment, it's not as painfully slow as people make it out to be, in my experience. I just don't agree with that. And certainly, if you're working in low light situations and you have the time to do that, the manual focus is excellent, and that can be done, and it works quite well. And you will find focus with that, even in the worst lighting.
There have also been comments regarding the lack of a RAW plus JPEG option.
First of all, there is RAW plus JPEG. This is a misconception that's been around for a long time. Camera has always produced a JPEG, even from the very beginning of the SD9. If one is using Sigma's software, the Sigma Photo Pro 3.5, under the File menu, after you click the thumbnail, there's a selection called Convert to JPEG File, and that's the in-camera JPEG. And you can click on that, and it will save that selected JPEG to the destination directory that you want. And you can also select the whole shebang that you have in a folder. You can select the 250, 300 things, and it will save all the JPEGs to that folder. There are patent reasons why this is not possible. I'm not familiar enough with the details of those patents, but I know that Sigma has just chosen this route to avoid patent issues. The reason that the camera has RAW support is that the original concept developed by Foveon and Sigma for the SD9 was that, why does anybody work with JPEGs? The people that were behind that, among others, the inventors, a guy named Dick Merrill and another one named Dick Line, they just felt that cameras should be RAW and nothing else, because with film you only have negatives. Anybody that's producing a negative and an instant picture, which would be the JPEG, was just wasting their time. The RAW file provides the best image in the end, and they were just very strict about that. So the earliest cameras, the SD9, the SD10, had JPEGs inside the folder, inside the files, but they were relatively difficult to extract. That's not the case anymore.
Do you anticipate a version 2 of the DP2 containing improvements in any of the areas we've discussed here?
I don't know if there'll be another version of the DP2. There has been some talk about another version of the DP1, and from that we can get some understanding of what's going on there, and that basically if they're going to change something and improve something, it's inside the camera. Again, they believe in these minimalistic designs, and that's the best way to... It's a device to take pictures. It's not a device to pull out of your Gucci bag and still look good. So I don't know about whether they're going to do that. I know that people have asked for different buttons and all this kind of stuff, but I really can't say. And if there is some changes made, they'll be inside the camera. That's essentially what's going to happen, probably.
Let's talk about those areas where the DP2 just blows away the competition. For one, the images this camera creates are amazing.
Well, first of all, it's a large imager, and secondly, it's a large, very good imager with exceptionally rich information, and it works efficiently, and it has an amazing lens. As I said, this lens is second to none in my experience. I'm sure that others have experienced other experience in that respect, but very few people have said that that there's anything wrong with the sharpness of the lens. If you have a very sharp imager and a very sharp lens, then you're starting from a very good point of view. You can always blur your image afterwards, but you can never make it truly sharper. Sharpening is generally done by looking for edge contrast, and if the image that comes out of the camera has a lot of edge contrast already, then you don't generally have to create it afterwards and create artifacts in the process. So that's certainly part of it. And through this, we get a very present image, one that, as I said, people have often talk about the 3D image quality and the three-dimensional ability of the lens or the camera to show the depth of within the image itself. And a lot of people talk about that. One thing that people don't talk about very much, but is certainly true if you start doing large work, which is what I do, very large prints, is that the amount of information at the pixel level is also very rich. If you start blowing these images up, you're starting from what I call full buckets of paint. And so when you blow it up, you obviously are spreading that paint around a little bit more, but each bucket started full. And with CFD technology, each bucket can only start 1/4 full because of the nature of the technology. There's just no way around that. That doesn't give get away from the fact that those images can be beautiful and fantastic in the end. But the Foveon images start with a full bucket of paint. If you look at them in their native resolution, which is where a lot of people do, they often say, I've never seen anything like that. If you start blowing them up, a lot of people still say they've never seen anything like that. And I've had that experience at most of the major shows around the world where people say that they've just never seen images like that in print, irrespective of what, it's otherwise hanging on the walls at these shows.
After hearing all the feedback on the DP1 and DP2, what would you yourself envision for, say, a DP3 if one were to be developed?
Well, I think people can assume that there are other cameras under development because Sigma has, in interviews from Japan, discussed the fact that this is an ongoing project. So there will most likely be a DP3 or a DP4. I don't know what they're going to develop there. The two things that are most frequently asked for are a zoom lens and interchangeable lens. Those are the things that people really want. The zoom lens is possible, but it may get away from the concept of the camera being pocketable. And I don't know how Sigma's going to solve that if they're going to work on something like that. And the second problem with that is that zoom lenses are, generally speaking, always a little bit less sharp than primes, fixed focal length lenses. And so they may have some trouble getting the same sharpness as they have now with the DP2, especially. The DP1 also was a very sharp lens. And then, of course, the third thing is what kind of range do they want to have? Do they want to have just the question of optical stabilization to stabilize the lens and things like that? If they're working with a zoom, I don't know. But that's certainly one area that people have talked about. The area of interchangeable lenses is, technically speaking, far more difficult, and we can see that with the latest offerings from Olympus, the EP1, that camera is physically larger than the DP2, even though in its specifications it's very similar. And the reason is that the interchangeable lens just has more stuff that has to be integrated into the construction to address the question of the interface. In other words, where the lens is actually mounted. You have to somehow get signals to go back and forth between the lens and the camera. You have to have room for this relatively clumsy device as opposed to a lens that's fixed onto there and things like that. And the second question that has to be addressed there is on the back of the camera, what kind of optical viewfinder are you going to provide for it? Is it going to be a large screen again, and will it serve its purpose there? That's something that people have often said the screen has to be made better, so if you're going to have an interchangeable lens and you get lenses that have considerable zoom power, then the LCD on the back has to be able to handle that kind of detail to really work satisfactorily, and that's another area that Sigma would have to address if they're going to put a zoom lens on it or an interchangeable lens. And all the electronics and things like that have to deal with that.
Regarding areas not mentioned, are there any you would like to address?
I think it's important for people, I've addressed it in part. I think people who buy these cameras have to understand a bit about themselves, and not just the camera itself, or not assume that they know everything about the camera. They should know as much about themselves. Do they really want a camera that takes primarily great pictures, or do they want a camera that's going to take pretty good pictures out in the backyard? Get to the sandbox. The DP1 and the DP2 will certainly do that, but it is primarily designed, and this was stated before the first DP camera was even released. They said that we're going to make cameras for photographers, and by photographers they mean real photographers, people who seriously want to take great images. And to that extent, the camera does that, and it does it very well, and both of them have done that very well. And if people approach it that way and say, "Oh, I am a photographer, I want to address that side of myself," this is a camera that I can work with very well. If they want something that's going to take snap, 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 or going to have great video capabilities and everything else, and all kinds of fine features and look pretty and, come in different colors, then they're probably looking at the wrong camera. But if they look inside themselves and say, I really am a photographer and I want to take great pictures, this is a camera that they could work with very well.
The retail price is?
The manufacturer suggests the retail price in the United States without taxes is about $870 or something like that. The street price is probably going to be $150 to $200 below that. I don't really know where that is right now. The price in Europe, it's about the same in euros. The camera includes a battery and meaningful is a lens hood, an AC power supply. There's an external flash, which is actually quite nice, very pocketable, great little thing to have along in your kit, which can be put in your pocket. And then there's an optical viewfinder, and that's the device. It's rather expensive. Sometimes it comes in packages, and that's a good way to get it. Street shooters will find it very good. A lot of other people might say, well, I really don't need that. That's certainly understandable. The hot shoe is where you can put your optical viewfinder. You can also put the external flash there, or you could put any other Sigma flash there, or for that matter, you can put any flash up there you want. You can also put studio flash equipment, a transmitter for studio flash equipment on top of it. That'll work just fine up there as well. The built-in flash has a pretty limited range. I believe it's 3 meters, about 10 feet. It's basically meant for close-up stuff.
Thank you, Laurence. We want you to know how much we appreciate you sharing your valuable time with us today, and we hope that you'll come back to visit us.
Thank you very much for having me, and look forward to talking to you again sometime.
This podcast brought to you by Imaging Insider. For more news and information, visit www.imaginginsider.com.